Alright, so I was tasked to do a video pretty much at the last minute, and this one seemed easy enough and just kind of jumped out at me. So, yeah. And obviously, Freaky Friday comes from the novel by Mary Rogers, which is actually a novel that I'm not really that big of a fan of. If it only uses one side of the concept for most of it until like the very end. It comes from, like, a different era, from, like, the early 70s, but still, the characters in it feel, like, weirdly aggressive to each other, like, big and small, and it just kind of comes off weird, and then it reaches that really, really convoluted ending that doesn't really make anything that came before it worthwhile. But the author did manage to sort of get to play with that more, given that she actually wrote the screenplay for the '76 movie, which I got way back in the day when all the video stores were closing, which explains the labeled sticker there, which I was never able to get off, but yeah. And the thing about this whole concept, even prior to that book, is just how far back this goes, because obviously it was like, it's almost like kind of an in-between thing, where we have source material that goes all the way back to the 1800s with Vice Versa, a lesson for fathers, which obviously eventually got its own sort of modern adaptation with the Judge Reinhold and Fred Savage movie from '88, but this was also, like, that movie came out, Vice Versa came out when it was, like, really, really big, like, the peak moment in the '80s when this body switching thing was, like, a constant. Everything from this to that Dudley Moore Kirk Cameron movie to, a lot of people consider Big one as well, even though there's only, it's not so much of a switch so much as just, he just grows. But Big is actually a lot closer to what the novel to Freaky Friday is. But obviously there was also a lot of different adaptations in between these two, with like there was a TV movie with Shelley Long and Gabby Hoffman that exists. And then, well, no, I said between, but after the remake, there was also the sort of stage musical, I guess you could call it that, because it wasn't like a Broadway thing or anything. And then that musical got a TV movie adaptation like a couple of years ago or something. So all of that, on like all the official remakes on top of just the body switching craze in general, it's very, very explored territory, though I want to say movie wise, the original Freaky Friday kind of set that off before it really exploded in the '80s. And yeah, as far as like the two of them, like there is the as far as actually adapting the novel, this is pretty close to it, but she did actually take advantage of the whole let's show both sides rather than just the one and then that stupid reveal at the end or whatever. That doesn't really explain anything. And it's not really explained in the movie either, apart from the fact that it's Friday the 13th, which in a comedy like this, that's really, like, as long as it's not too convoluted, but it's simple enough, it'll still work. Especially if it's, the where Disney was at this particular time, where, like, all their movies, no matter how, what the concepts were, how sort of downplayed they seem to be. When I say downplayed, of course, I mean, like, you think, like, the really over-the-top slapstick that they would do. And while that's certainly here, like, the whole thing basically feels like an extended sitcom episode with, like, the bubbles out of the washing machine and all that stuff, still managed to find its way to that Disney formula at the time, where somehow even a movie like this ends in a gigantic car chase that, like, is trying to rival What's Up, Doc? Uh, but which seems kind of out of place. But when you look at the Disney formula at the time, when you had stuff like The Shaggy Dog or Million Dollar Duck or whatever, those movies that, like, no matter what their concepts were, always ended in some big giant slapstick car chase, weirdly enough. It just kind of went in the direction of one of those. But there is something about the both lead performances from Barbara Harris and Jodie Foster, both of which earned them Golden Globe nominations. And there's something sort of inherent to Barbara Harris, I think, to where she was able to do both. She was able to do and Jamie Lee Curtis really pulls this off also. Jamie Lee Curtis, I actually think more so. Where you can very much buy them as the sort of, straight-laced mom or whatever, and, like, has all the strict rules and all that. But then when it comes to them doing the playful side of the performance, when they have, a 13-year-old mind, the performance is just as authentic, if not maybe even more so than when they're playing it straight, or playing the mother role, or whatever. And what's interesting about Jodie Foster in particular in this role with the adult mind inside her is that Jodie Foster was kind of already there, despite her age, where it was like she was already always playing like those sort of precocious characters, but then, interestingly enough, two very different movies from Freaky Friday also came out the same year, I believe, in '76, because well, it came out very late '76. It got, like, a limited release just in Los Angeles in '76, and then it went wide in '77, but it's technically '76, which is the same year as Taxi Driver and The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane. Which are obviously these very adult movies. And the roles in which she plays also are very... There had to be a certain maturity to them. You could really throw Bugsy Malone into this as well. So it's almost like it was inevitable that she just literally plays an adult at the age that she was at the time. And it's to my understanding that they actually... Because it seems like the most obvious thing to do would be to bring Jodie Foster in for the remake in place of Jamie Lee Curtis. And apparently they did, like, that was the initial idea, but the thing was that Foster wisely came to the conclusion that the remake kind of needed to stand on its own and kind of do its own thing and have its own feel, which it does. So you can see how this really paid off, but Foster thought that if it was her playing the part instead of Jamie Lee Curtis, that the movie would have just kind of stopped at being gimmicky. Like, it would have been, oh, Jodie Foster's now playing the actual adult, and that's what the whole purpose of the movie was. And so, like, that would be the only reason it would exist, and people would pretty much only see it for that. So I thought that was actually a really good choice on her part, even though it does, on the surface, if you don't know the story, seem like, well, you kind of dropped the ball on the obvious thing there, but, yeah, I do think they took the better route, especially since Jamie Lee Curtis did it so perfectly. To the point that you sort of see, like it almost feels like the attraction in Freaky Friday is, I mean, I don't know if it's because Jodie Foster, obviously, is a name that people recognize much more than Barbara Harris, but it almost seems like the attraction to see Jodie Foster play the adult type, because, like I said, she was pretty much already on her way there, and then the fact that she does it so seamlessly, that transition... it feels like the remake is more of is a Jamie Lee Curtis attraction, despite how good Lindsay Lohan is as well. Because I'm not necessarily on this train that Lindsay Lohan was going to be like, like, I keep hearing the whole comparison that if Lindsay Lohan had not gone down the path she went down, she would have Emma Stone's career. I don't know that I fully buy that. I don't know that I think personally that she was that good, but but I do see where she did have a lot of talent, and she really did make and we're talking like she's dead or something, but yeah, when she's playing the character with the adult in her mind, I do think it's stronger than when she's sort of just playing her own age. Because it's almost like she kind of has that maturity in her inherently, sort of like Foster, but maybe not near to the extent that Foster did. But as far as bringing over cast members, there is one unexpected choice that carries over from one movie to the next, which is actually a nice little joke, where Jamie Lee Curtis is going to her office and she's not sure, who her patients are exactly by face, and she's waiting for Evan, the Willie Garson character, and when the delivery guy walks in, she says, "You're Evan, right?" And he says, "No, I'm Boris." And shows his name tag, and it is the guy that played Boris in the original movie. So I think some people think it's supposed to be the same character, but I I doubt it. It's just a reference. It's just a little in joke. But you may also recognize him from the Back to the Future movies as well. So as far as how they pull this off, there is I do like the transition in the remake much more, where it's like in the original, it's the case of it just kind of happens spontaneously, and like there's not a lot of build up to it, but like just enough to establish the characters themselves before they just automatically switch places, and they're in different places at the time, and they stay in different places for most of the movie. Like there's no real interacting between the two, which is something that kind of carried over from the novel. But it might almost seem like the obvious way to go and the predictable way to go, but I think it actually works more in the remake. That, number one, it happens overnight, and I love that it's shown by their sleeping styles, shows the change happening overnight. But then them having to interact a lot at the beginning before they go, like we're almost building up and leading to them going their separate ways, which is what pretty much the entirety of the original movie is. But I think that's a lot of the strongest aspects of the remake is the two of them interacting and the banter that they have. Like the banter isn't as strong like pre-change, but once they change and they're just doing constant back and forths, it's really the strength of both of their performances in a lot of cases. Like and just some of the little moments there, like when Jamie Lee Curtis calls her a fun sucker. Like I actually dropped that line once in real life conversation, and I was so happy that there was one person that knew what I was referencing. And yeah, that really, like, I think that also kind of helps their performances show off more what it is they're doing. Because you would think it'd be them interacting with their surroundings and what they have to do when they're posing as the other. But I feel like the fact that they switch personalities comes through in performances even more when they're interacting with each other, because you can really, like, really see the differences between the two of them and how they're playing off of each other. So there's that, but there's also something valuable to what's going on here in the original as well, even if they're not, playing off each other. Like, there's just some little moments here and there. Like, there's, for every little moment, like in the remake, when there's the moment that I love that kind of, where she's showing, like, her motherly ways without dialogue. And she's talking, but it's a moment that's outside of that, where one of her friends has her shirt, like, up to here, and she just kind of, while she's talking about something else, just kind of pulls her shirt down for her. There's also moments like the typewriter bit in the original movie, which is another scene that feels like right out of one of the old Kurt Russell Disney movies or something. There was a very close formula in Disney in the 70s and 80s in particular. Or just the 70s in particular. But, like, the typewriter moment when she's watching it go back and forth, and it's like the way Jodie Foster can just pull a face like that is really valuable to this as well, and the sort of comedic factor to it. And not necessarily just the concept itself. Those little moments are going to really help it out a lot. And the little things that add up. But there is one sort of plot thread that also, I think, works better in the remake, and certainly works better in both than it does in the novel. In the novel, it just seems really weirdly placed. And that is the idea of the guy that the daughter has a crush on. That being Boris in the original movie, and then Jake, the Chad Michael Murray character in the remake. And as far as, like, the novel goes, Boris just always seemed like a weird character to me. It's like, why? Like, he seems obviously a bit older, and obviously Jake is the same way, but it feels much more natural between Chad Michael Murray and Lindsay Lohan, I guess. But when you look at Boris, like, he has that older vibe about him. He's got the weird voice that's just like a running joke with him, because of his whatever's going on with him. And then there's the moment when he just, like, stops to critique Annabelle's room, like, harshly. And it's like, who the hell does that? It's like, there's so many things about the Boris character that never quite make sense. And when he gets attached to her, it feels really like her and her mom's body. It just kind of feels weird. And it's like I said, with Chad Michael Murray and Jamie Lee Curtis, it feels like there's much more, weirdly enough, something there. But I think it also plays a lot to because the thing about that I think works about Chad Michael Murray's performance is how funny he can be with this character. Because you would think this character would be just sort of nothing more than that potentially bad boy boyfriend that she wants or whatever. But that he was able to bring the comedy to it that he did, I think, makes him more memorable than Boris. Whether it be him, singing Britney Spears outside the house, or taking that little pratfall at the rehearsal dinner. It really weirdly works. And like I said, there's even the moment where when he's connecting to Anna as Jamie Lee Curtis, you actually do almost feel like there is something between them without it being too weird. Like, you almost forget for a second. But I think that's also a credit to Curtis for being able to make the performance, like, so authentic that that kind of thing can just sort of slip by you. So that's basically, like, the point I'm basically getting to is that I I feel like the remake did, like, you would think the remake, especially with the way it's modernized, would feel very like, oh, why does this need to exist? And oh, they're taking all the obvious things, like playing the Turtles song Happy Together at the beginning, and then transitioning it to the updated version, which is actually a pretty decent transition to show you that it's like, yeah, we're in this new era now, but while that would probably seem like, I don't know, like there'd be a cringe factor to it, especially if they did it today. Like, I don't know about that, how that musical did it, but, or if they succeeded at all, but it just seems like one of those things that would be so obvious that it just wouldn't quite work. And it sort of confronts that and is able to do stuff with that in the way that I don't think the 70s version was able to, where 70s version is the same way where for that era you can see the beats coming, and it's like, they're headed in that direction, but it's like, what can they do to sort of either, not necessarily dance around it, but almost embrace it but make it better. And the 70s version just kind of goes through the beats, it feels like, to what the Disney formula was at that time. But the remake is always kind of like taking that, but kind of adding like something fresh to it. Like for every situation we have in the 70s one where it's like, oh, there's too many bubbles coming out of the washing machine or whatever. Or, oh, there's all this business stuff she has to do. With the remake, we get stuff like the talk show scene, which kind of goes on its own path and really gives, Curtis the room to, like, really do this really over-the-top stuff, and it just really works in this way, and, like, almost in an unexpected way. Like, it's almost like you could argue that the remake should not be as good as it is, yet they just managed to pull it off. With obviously the actors having a lot to do with that, because another thing that we really get a lot of in the remake that we don't really see in the original is a certain sincerity. And there is, like, you can, credit the 70s one by not going too much into, sentimentality or whatever, where it is just, like, a sort of slapstick movie at its core, and that's what it sort of sticks to when we get to the end. And, there is a lesson there, but they're not too overbearing about it, but you might also say they're almost too passive about it. Like, they don't establish it enough. So the sincerity that comes with the remake, where we have, obviously with Curtis being a widow, already has a lot of underlying emotion to it. But to have these scenes where it's like, when they eventually have to confront this, and like that's the reason a lot of the time they're kind of at each other's throats, is because she wants to marry Mark Harmon now, and Lowen thinks it's way too soon, and once again, that's a cliche in itself, of course. But the way they handle it in this scene at the rehearsal dinner at the end, when she breaks down and says, we need to postpone, like, we've reached a point now to where we have to postpone it, but not just because of the whole body switching thing, but because of how you feel about it, and that's something that I was ignoring. And it's a really big, like, effective emotional moment when she goes to the front of the room and ends up basically just embracing Mark Harmon and this marriage and all that. And it's this really, once again, it takes all that stuff that would seem cliche and predictable, but there's like enough sincerity and heart in it that it really makes it work, and it's like a genuinely emotional moment. Especially with that's when the body switch happens, and she just gets to kind of continue that in her own body, and it just really works out, which is great. And that's something else that I actually really love about the remake. There is a cliche moment that you expect in the remake that never comes, which is great and a big strength to it. And that is, and I mean, I like what they do in the '70s movie also, where they go in this direction, but it doesn't turn out in the way you think. The fact that if either of these movies were lesser movies, and I feel like the remake was more vulnerable to this because movies of the era that the remake came out seemed much more susceptible to falling into cliches because a laziness was starting to really go into play. If either of these movies were a lesser movie, we would have the big dramatic moment where they try to explain what has happened to people on the outside of this, and conflict ensues. Like, people don't believe them, and they try really hard to explain it and make it sound believable, and then you'd have to wait until those characters finally believe it, but not before everybody sulks. And that doesn't come, like, in the '76 version, the way they play with it is they do try to explain, but just nobody seems to acknowledge it. Which is funny in itself, but I love the fact that in the remake, they never even try. It is never, like, hinted at, that I remember anyway, where they try to tell somebody what's going on. Because it's just so, like the characters in the remake are smart enough to be like, what would that solve, even trying? Like, nobody is going to buy this, so let's just not go down that path. Because, like I said, if they tried to go down that path, there'd be the moment where, you know, Mark Harmon would get all pissed off, and she'd have to win him back, or whatever. And the same thing with her friends, probably. But yeah, the conflict comes from him catching her with Chad Michael Murray on Chad Michael Murray's bike. But I think the thing that makes that okay and not feel like it's just falling into lazy cliches is how likable Mark Harmon's character is. Because it is the case where they could have very easily made him the douchebag potential stepdad. And he'd be almost some sort of villain in the story or whatever. But the fact that they made him, like, really super likable, and the scenes with him and Harold Gould, who plays her dad, there's, like, a whole dynamic there between the two of them, pretty much in the background, which is really great. And it's also something the '76 movie is missing, these great side characters. Like, characters are constantly coming in and out of the '76 movie, but, like, none of them resonate whatsoever. But, you know, you always go back to Mark Harmon and the relationship he has with her dad, pretty much in the background. Another great character in the remake is Mr. Bates, the teacher, played by Stephen Tobolowsky. I love his first scene. I've always loved his first scene when he's walking around and he's handing out the tests and he's whistling. And then when she sees that she has an F, and he just looks over at her, and his whistle goes into a disapproving tone. It's just and that by itself establishes that whole character. And then there's the whole kind of creepy thing going on there, where it's like, even though she's smart and she knows what she's talking about, he's still failing her just because Jamie Lee Curtis rejected him however long ago. And it's like there is something weird to that, but it's there just enough for like comedy's sake than anything else, that it's like, all right. Not so much some of the weirder stuff in the '76 movie. That's kind of, it might kind of just take you out of it, to maybe possibly to a point of no return. But yeah, but like I said, the remake is just full of stuff that I love, and stuff that that I've kind of taken away from it. Like I talked about how I dropped Fun Sucker in regular conversation. There's also the scene where she says, when you go into the office and you're pretending to be a therapist, just keep saying, how do you feel about that? And, like, that's just all you say. Which lends its own jokes, but it's like, pretty much every time anybody mentions a therapist or I see a therapist in a movie or a TV show or whatever, the first thing I think of is how many times do they say, and how do you feel about that? Which comes back to this. Um, so, yeah, and so, like I said, the way they're able to kind of use all that different stuff, whereas the 76 one almost feels like, as far as the predictability goes, it eventually lends itself to, like, almost a repetitiveness that I'm not, like, totally crazy about. So, yeah, I don't, like, dislike the 76 movie or anything, in the way that I kind of don't care for the novel, but, like I said, I do think there were many improvements with her adapting it into the screenplay format for this and getting to play with both sides rather than just one. Um, but, like, when a lot of it is, like, the water ski stuff and, the field hockey stuff or whatever it is, where it's just her playing sports. It just feels like it's... And the band scene, they just all kind of feel like they're all grouped together, and they're just the same scene. Just in different locations with her having to do a different task. But it feels pretty much exactly the same beats and everything. Like I said, already had like a Disney formula it was going down, where there was a lot of movies in that era that just looked like this in general, aesthetically and otherwise. Um, but like I said, the remake has to go in those directions, but it feels fresh enough, like mainly through the performances, but also some of the situations and the different directions they go. Really, like I said, her going on the talk show is like a classic, almost sitcom beat. But it's the way Curtis plays it and the way the scene itself plays out is what really makes it work. So there's that. And obviously the book did end up having a couple more sequels. There was A Billion for Boris, I think it was called, where it's like, it came out before, but it's very similar to the plot of Back to the Future 2. Where they have like a TV, they can like tell the future, and so they start placing sports bets and all that. And then there is a Summer Switch, where we get the moment that's teased at the end of both movies, where in this case it's the grandpa and the son, but in this it's the father and the son, which is where the roots started with the original vice versa story from the 1800s. And Summer Switch basically just became another one of another version of the vice versa story. So. And I think Summer Switch also got a movie as well with Seth Green in it, I think. I don't even think he played the main kid, but he was... yeah, so overall, I think that's how I feel about these. And yeah, I think I vastly prefer the remake. But the original is almost a movie I hardly ever go back to. Like, even as a kid, I wasn't really that into the original, but I remember I actually ended up seeing, I don't even remember why, like how this managed to happen, but I ended up seeing the remake twice in theaters. And like, it was one of those movies that I just kind of liked immediately, in a way that I didn't feel about the original, and as I've grown up and gone on, I still feel the same way. I vastly prefer the remake to the original, but yeah, so that's pretty much all the reasons for that. So, there's a few things coming from me, like, all close together here. I don't know in what order they're going to come out, but it'll be a versus my brother and a review video. Somewhere will be all clumped here together, and then whatever comes after that. With all of our, group videos being still starting in August, as far as I know, and we're just going to run with it and see what happens. So until all that stuff, I think that's it for this.